Hey everyone, here I am live and in person. We're doing things a little differently this week. I know last week I talked about doing a cast members of MC Magic Q&A episode, and that is in the works. We are doing that. I've collected all the questions. I've talked to the cast members. There were like scheduling issues that caused us to have to delay it, so it'll probably be next week as opposed to this week. So I figured this week, since I didn't have any questions from you guys for a general Q&A, I figured I'd make this sort of video that I've been wanting to make for a long time. One question that I receive a lot over the year that I've been doing this channel is how I know what I know about Disney. And I figured rather than answering each person as I get asked it, I would make a video that sort of explains what I've been reading and what I check in on to sort of amass what I know about Disney. Now, of course, the easy answers are I've gone to Disney a lot of times, so there's sort of a personal experience there. And then the slightly less easy answer is there's this great podcast called WDW Radio. It's hosted by Lou Mongello. Some of you might know about it. It's a weekly radio podcast all about Disney World, the history of it, news, Q&A, top tens. Every week he does something different, and it's a fantastic sort of longer form of sort of what I want to bring to the channel. So sometimes it'll be like a 60-minute history of, you know, the Great Movie Ride, for instance, or it'll be him and somebody else talking about the top 10 smells in Walt Disney World, and throughout that you get peppered information. So that's a great source. If you ever want more Disney content on a weekly basis, I highly suggest heading over to WDW Radio and checking it out. Now, beyond those two options, I read a lot about Disney, and I figured the bulk of this video and what I wanted to do with this video is sort of show off the books that I've read that I think are great for learning more about Disney. So, without further ado, let's get started. Now, I think obviously the core book that you're going to want to look for is an American Original, Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas. It is the Walt Disney biography. It is not the only Walt Disney biography, but by many it's considered the better of the biographies. I haven't read other biographies about Walt Disney, so I can't speak as to how it compares, but this one's very good. It gives you a pretty in-depth look at the life of Walt, and from what I've read, it is fairly accurate. So Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas. Now, also by Bob Thomas, and also in the same vein as the biography, is Building a Company. This is about Roy O. Disney, who was Walt's brother. A lot of people don't really remember Roy, unfortunately, but he was Walt's partner, and he was sort of the logical side of the business, and he created the cash flow that allowed Walt to take a lot of those projects he had in his mind and make them a reality. So a lot of this stuff is also covered in Walt Disney and American Original because they are brothers, they grew up together, so a lot of that overlaps, and then later they worked at the same company, so a lot of that overlaps, but it does give you an interesting and more, I think, business-oriented perspective of the Walt Disney Company in those years. And also, of course, he outlived his brother up until the creation of Walt Disney World, so it covers that a little bit as well. There's some other memoirs. We've got here In Service to the Mouse by Jack Lindquist. Jack Lindquist was the first president of Disneyland. It's basically just his random memoirs. They're random stories throughout his career, from beginning at Disney all the way up until, you know, what he did towards the end. Really funny. It's great because he doesn't speak from a company perspective in that sense that it isn't cleaned up. It isn't to serve the nature. It's not to serve the interests of the Walt Disney Company today. So he can look back and give you an honest retelling of some of the things that went on in Disney without sort of keeping it, you know, neat and tidy. You know, he's willing to talk about the negative aspects as well as the positive. And it's also a surprisingly funny memoir. Now, he was the first president of Disneyland, so most of the stories involve working at Disneyland. This is where you can get some interesting history at the, you know, the early years of the parks. And then he did have some involvement in Disney World, Epcot, things like that. So there are stories here and there. And in a similar vein, you have Spinning Disney's World by Charles Ridgway. Now, Charles Ridgway was the press agent or the press secretary, the main press person for Disney for quite a while. And he did a lot of work with, again, similar to Jack Lindquist, with Disneyland. And then later on, he touched on and worked with Disney World a bit. This is a little more, I don't want to say politically correct, but I would say it's definitely more safe. It is a safer, set of memoirs, but also a very interesting set because both Jack Lindquist and Charles Ridgway, they did at times work with Walt, so there are stories in there about Walt and what it was like working with him. Now, if you're a fan of specifically Disney World, this book is one that you're going to want to pay attention to. This is Reality Land, and it is by David Pomey. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This is probably, in my experience so far, the best telling of the story of the construction of Disney World. This starts essentially with Walt deciding he wanted this project in Florida, and it chronicles from buying the property in secret to the announcement, and then his death, and then the entire construction up until opening day. It then goes beyond further. It talks about Epcot. It even talks about Hollywood Studios, but at the time it was MGM. It talks about the Animal Kingdom even. So it goes up until, I want to say, the early 2000s. Now it does have sort of, I think, a biased take at the post Epcot era. You can tell the author clearly was not a fan of Michael Eisner. I feel like it shows. But like the first half of the book, maybe the first 2/3 of the book, are all about building Disney World up until opening day. And it gives you a lot of cool insights as to what that was like. And it shows how difficult it was of a project. And it also really shows how many hardships they ran into in building it. You think about a construction project today and usually it's on developed land, but they really did pick like this spot in the middle of nowhere in Florida, and they had to turn this wilderness into a theme park, and this is a great way of learning about how they did that. So those sort of like I categorize as the memoir section, or the story retelling. Now these are the later Disney books. So first up, this is what I consider, I have this on the Kindle, so it's a little different. This is, I think, a must-buy if you're a big fan of learning about the newer Disney era. It's called Disney War. It's by James P. Stewart. It's a pretty big book. Like I said, I got the ebook version. It is a complete chronicling of the Michael Eisner era of Disney. And it does so independently. They did have permission. The author was there for all of it, and he was able to chronicle it. But at the same time, it wasn't like a Disney authorized book in the sense that they had to okay everything. So it does paint, I think, a very realistic picture of what it was like during the Eisner years. It definitely doesn't sugarcoat it. Now, what's interesting is, while that book was being written, Michael Eisner wrote his autobiography called Work in Progress, and this is essentially a cutout of Disney War, but it is super sugar-coated. And I think I wouldn't suggest this like for everybody to read, but I think it is an interesting thing to read alongside with Disney War, because you get to see two different sides of the same stories from one objective view and one very subjective view. For instance, a big story of the Eisner era was his troubles with Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was the producer of Little Mermaid and the animation renaissance of Disney, and he eventually left and went on to co-found DreamWorks, Shrek and things like that. And in Disney War, they portray it very realistically as the big Hollywood mess it was, because there were a lot of contractual disagreements. But here in Michael Eisner's book, since he was involved in those disagreements, he paints it as like a very minor issue. Now, like I said, Disney War is a very big, I think it's like 600 or 700 pages. It's a pretty big book. If that's too much for you, there's a book called The Keys to the Kingdom The Rise of Michael Eisner and the Fall of Everybody Else by Kim Masters. I would consider this to be sort of like an abridged version of Disney War. It covers the same era, covers the same content. I do think it is also pretty unbiased, although at times it seems to be like it's written against Michael Eisner. But it's a much shorter, not okay, maybe not much shorter. It's about 450 pages, but a good read nonetheless. Let's see, what else do I have in this pile? So we have this book here, The Mouse Machine: Disney and Technology, by J.P. Telote? I can't pronounce names if you haven't noticed. I'll be 100% honest with you. I haven't finished this book. I started it. It is about technology and Disney, as the title implies. However, there is such a heavy focus on the technology. In fact, I think part of the reason I never really finished the book is because I don't think it was written intended for Disney fans as much as it was written intended for like engineers who look to Disney as like a source of inspiration. In fact, there were a couple of books that I have similar to that, and I'm going to pull one up now on my Kindle. Here we go. It is Building a Better Mouse: The Story of the Electronic Imagineers Who Designed Epcot, by Steve Alcorn and David Green. Very similarly, this is a book for engineers, by engineers, about engineering. If you can understand some of the stuff they're talking about in this book, then by all means you should dive into it. However, it's not the sort of thing, I don't know, it's a heavy read. And it's also one that I never fully completed, that I need to get to at some point. At that point, my interest was mainly in the history of the company. And then I've got one more book here that I would like to share. And this is a great one. This one's called The Vault of Walt. Let's pull up, by Jim Korkis. Now, Jim Korkis, if you listen to the WDW radio show, you might recognize the name. He's on there very often whenever Lou does any sort of historical piece about a ride or attraction, a park, that sort of thing. Jim Korkis seems to really know his stuff. And the Vault of Walt, what it is essentially a collection of stories that he's told. They're unauthorized, uncensored, just stories about Walt. Some of them involve, the animation side of things or the theme park and, just various sides of the company. But the focus is, of course, on Walt. So, it doesn't go much beyond, his death. And there isn't always a guaranteed focus on the theme parks. But it's I think any book that sort of gives you an insight into Walt's life gives you a good understanding of how he was approaching the company. And then I've got 3 more books here to show you. This one's a quick one. I picked this up when I was at Disney World. It's not like much reading. It's just the quotable Walt Disney. And it's just a book full of Disney quotes. And it's a good way to, I don't know. He's got some pretty interesting quotes in here that I think give you an insight to what he was like. And they're not always like the cliche inspirational ones. I mean, what do we have here? You may not realize it when it happens, but a kick in the teeth may be the best thing in the world for you. Okay, that's sort of inspirational. I don't pose as an authority on anything at all. I follow the opinions of the ordinary people I meet, and I take pride in the close-knit teamwork with my organization. Like, that's not the sort of thing you put on, like, the back of the book, but it gives you, like, a little insight into how he approached running the Walt Disney Company. And then these final 2 books. These I have not finished reading for very different reasons. I actually love the content in them. In fact, unfortunately, the form factor doesn't really allow me to bring it on the train and read when I'm going to work. So the first one is Since the World Began, The Walt Disney World, the First 25 Years. It's by Jeff Curdy. It's a coffee table book. There's a lot of cool imagery, art, that sort of thing. Also talks about the creation. I imagine a lot of this stuff would be a sort of cleaned up version of what you would see in Reality Land, the other book I showed you. But there's just some great photography in here. It covers, MGM Studios. Just some cool looking stuff here. So there's always that. These are books that they don't really sell anymore in bookstores, so I've found these on like Amazon, and I try to pick them up whenever I can because I don't see them very often. And then this final book, I don't know if I'm ever going to get through it. Walt Disney's Epcot Center, Creating the New World of Tomorrow. There's no credited author. Abrams? That could be the publisher. I bought this and was sort of, I don't want to say deceived, but it was not what I was expecting it to be. I thought this would be a very in-depth, history of Epcot. What this ended up being, this is essentially a promotional book. In fact, what's the exact date on this? Here we go, 1982. So this book was essentially like, promotional material for Epcot. So there aren't any real like juicy stories about the building of it because it's very clean and it's essentially a big book to sell you on going to Epcot. Now, what is cool about it is there is a lot of cool imagery in the book. A lot of photographs of animatronics, things of that nature. They cover all the pavilions. And the text isn't really in depth. I've never really gone into this book when I was preparing for a Minecraft Disney World video because there's nothing of real value there. The text is essentially a brochure for that attraction. But like, again, really cool look into them creating all of the physical aspects of the park. So in any case, those are the books that I've been reading or that I have read in the past. Some of them I'm still working on about Walt Disney World, Walt Disney the company, and Walt Disney the man. And a lot of that has collectively built up a lot of the knowledge that I use in the videos that I make. If I had to suggest any two books in this entire pile, the first one would be Disney Lore, and the second one would be Reality Land. This is actually the only book in the pile that I've read multiple times because just going back to this story of the creation of Disney World is really interesting. This is my favorite out of the whole thing. I hope this was informative. I hope you have a fantastic week. Whatever you're doing, make the most of it. And again, next week will hopefully be the episode with the CMs. So if you have a question regarding general Disney stuff or a question for the CMs regarding MC Magic, I'll take both this week so that whichever way the episode goes, we'll have content. Have a great week, everybody, and I will see you here next weekend for the next episode of the Walt Disney Q&A. Bye, everyone.